Notre après-midi de conférence. Donc cet après-midi, on débute avec M. John Oliffe. Oliffe, ouais? Yeah, Oliffe, I'm sorry. Qui est professeur à l'École de soins infirmiers à l'Université de Colombie-Britannique. Le programme de recherche sur les masculinités et la santé des hommes du Dr Oliffe a mis l'accent sur le cancer de la prostate, la dépression, le suicide et le tabagisme chez les hommes. Il a également collaboré en fournissant son expertise à un éventail de problèmes de santé chez les hommes, dont la santé sexuelle des jeunes hommes, la santé des hommes incarcérés, la paternité, la violence conjugale chez les hommes gays et les expressions du deuil chez les hommes suite à la mort d'un père masculin. Une grande partie de son travail est de nature qualitative, et bien qu'il ait décrit en profondeur un éventail de problèmes de santé des hommes, Dr Oliffe a également mis en pratique bon nombre de ces notions lors d'interventions pour améliorer la santé et le bien-être des hommes et leurs familles. Dr Oliffe n'a pas déclaré de conflit d'intérêt ni d'apparence de conflit d'intérêt non plus. Alors, welcome, Dr Oliffe.
Voilà. Thank you. Thanks. I often forget to thank people at the end of the presentation, so I'll thank people at the start of the presentation. I'd like to thank Movember for sponsoring this event and also sponsoring a large amount of the work that we do, and also the great people at ProfIL and Extenso. And there's been lots of emails going up and back, and I really appreciate when people are organised and helping us, get the work done. It's really encouraging as well. I've been doing this work for 15 years, and honestly, it's great that we're starting to get a little bit of mainstream interest, for want of a better word. It felt like draft dodging for many of those years, and it's just great that we get an opportunity to discuss a few things in some depth. I today thought I'd talk a little bit about something I haven't really talked about before, in relation to masculinities, food and body image. I sort of thought I'd have 3 goals, because that was kind of what was asked for. And my disclaimer is that each one of these goals could constitute, a nice, 1-hour seminar, lecture kind of thing. So I've gone for breadth, and what I've done is I've tried to thread in some work that we've done that relates to these issues, and I've also tried to get a little bit of a feel for the field around the drive for masculinity, etc., that could help us think about some of those things. So I'm not claiming a systematic review, and my disclaimer is that I'm not an expert in food, body image and masculinities. So we've done a lot of work over the years. We've done works in depression and suicide amongst men, prostate cancer, haemophilia, sexually transmitted infections, immigrant men's health. So we've done an array of things. And you can find all of those chronicled on our website, menshealthresearch.ubc.ca. But just to lift into a little bit of a piece around trying to get into the whole bit around food and body image is what I'll do in the next little while. Before I do that, it's so interesting. We often think that we're talking about the same thing when we're talking about masculinity. We're not. For me, it's about masculinities. And it was so important that we actually talked about a plurality of masculinities, because it helped us to break with the essentialist notion that somehow men were hardwired not to do health, and that somehow they were predisposed to die 7 years younger than women. Because it opens up the possibilities that we can intervene in ways that can help. And one of the pieces of evidence that's rarely cited, but so incumbent on all of us to think about, is that the gap between men and women's life expectancy is closing, and we're all living longer. So in Canada, and in particular in British Columbia, we're actually down to 4.7 years. Now, 30 years ago, it was 7.4 years. The gap is actually closing. We're all living longer. So I think, the masculinities piece is key for thinking about how we do the business of men's health. I think there's flow-on benefits to everybody as well. And so I was really buoyed by the comments late in that presentation with Chris today, is just to say, this gender relations piece is absolutely critical to how we think about men's health. Because ultimately, if we intervene with men to make a difference with men, I guarantee you there's flow-on benefits to women and children and other men. It just means that, our approaches need to be oftentimes men-centred to try and get an audience and to try and create change. When I do the masculinities work, I talk about gender, relations, identities and roles. And so to try and link to food, just an example of gender relations is that we often kind of set up this binary. So men are often charged with the idea of doing filling, fueling, calorically dense foods, an alignment, masculine foods. Back in Australia, they used to talk about feed the man meat. It was one of those things where it was kind of built in that certain way. And as the poem suggests of women, sugar and spice and all things nice, that's what little girls are made of. And so it's kind of set up a binary. And I'm not suggesting that that binary and that stereotypes are reasonable, but it's a starting place for a lot of people in terms of how they think about food and how they engage with it. The other piece of gender relations that I just sort of thought of in the discussion in the back half of the conversation today is there are gender relations between practitioners and clients. And many of you are kind of clinicians. And you co-construct masculinities and femininities in your interactions with clients. So never underestimate the value of your ability to influence how someone is. Because when we locate the problem primarily in the patient who can't go to the doctor because of masculinity, we've already made some decisions about how that person's going to be in the room. So even if you take that on board and you go, oh, well, they're in the room, what did they have to transgress in terms of masculine ideals to be here? That would be a great starting point because you've already got an open book, I'd argue. In terms of gender identities, I often think about how guys are, and so I've lifted this one. It's the lumbosexual. So the lumbosexual eats organic foods, he drinks craft beers and cocktails, and you'll find him at the locally owned coffee shop and farm-to-table establishments. He's eating well, savouring every bite. In the countryside, he might be a subsistence farmer, picking eggs from his chicken coop and living off the things he grows and cultivates. It's an identity. The guy's picking up an identity. We got a ton of these blokes in Vancouver, and they go to a place called Whole Foods. And they buy Whole Foods and they sell produce that's produced within a 100-mile radius of Vancouver. So it's a kind of identity. And it's different to the filling identity, to the filling, fueling foods. These guys are kind of different in how they approach it. So I think identities are fascinating, and they're plural also for a reason, because they change across time, they change in relation to place, they change in relation to socio-economic status. So the choice to shop at Whole Foods is one that you have to have a pretty reasonable kind of bank balance. They often call it whole check in Vancouver. It's really quite expensive. So again, when we talk about masculinities, we often abstract it like we just are talking about one thing, but all these other social determinants hook in to masculinities. Socioeconomic status, social class, all of those things. So poor men eat differently to rich men. The other part is gender roles. And we gave a bit of a nod today to the idea of breadwinner. And so a traditional kind of way for men to be is to aspire to be able to trade their body labour or intellectual labour for money to be able to provide for families. So traditional breadwinner piece. And we often talk these days about, how we're getting away from that, but many men still buy into that cultural norm, that traditional notion of masculinity, that they should be the primary breadwinner. So again, in terms of roles, many men align very, very closely to what they do as a job as being, central to who they are. So I often think about masculinities in these terms. The other thing, we've sort of talked about, Connell got a nod this morning with John McDonald, and, she was very good around the plurality of masculinities. I think it was incredibly important for the reasons I've mentioned. And I think too, when we're talking about body types, one of the things that we can sort of get into is these labels. And we say, well, that's plurality. So for example, the built fat, the athletic, the fat as fat ass. And they all imply a certain discipline around the body. Or not. Or a certain recklessness. And so when we talk about plurality, part of the challenge in health is to go, even though I'm talking about plurality, I need to find patterns in order to be able to talk to specific tropes or types. And as clinicians, we battle with this all the time. Because people say, you're essentialising the very things you said that there was a plurality about. I tend to think that we're on the hook for solutions and we're on the hook for remedy, interventions. And so that demands oftentimes that we need to come up with subgroups and look for patterns and go, okay, here's a potential remedy and how I could address that. I've stolen this from Steve Robertson, who's going to talk after, but I think transformative masculinities we don't talk enough about. So oftentimes when we talk about plurality, we'll put them in a certain box and we'll say these are the patterns, and we talk about them in a very cross-sectional way. But we know that guys change across their lifespan. We know there's changes that happen, there's transformative changes. So whether it's, the loss of weight, reducing weight, changing things around exercise and diet, we know that they can emerge over time. We also know that transformative-wise, things can be very different in certain scopes of practice or communities of practice, we've referred to them as before, as being places where you might be of a certain ilk. So I had the biggest plate of risotto last night I've ever seen, and I don't think I even would have got something that big back in British Columbia, but it was within a milieu of that opportunity and a particular configuration of practice where I was with a bunch of colleagues who are here today. So transformative, can refer to those changes in certain contexts and across life course. Of course, no presentation would be complete without a Bieber slide. So my point here is that you've watched a boy grow up in public eye, and so he's moved into an Ottoman kind of stance or body embodiment, and he's made the front page of Men's Health. Some of the critique around him for this photo shoot was huge. It was actually bigger than the picture itself, in which one of the guys who was an editor with Men's Health suggested that if he could just get 15, 20 minutes alone with Bieber, he could help him understand that things work outside of him, get him out of the I place. And so it's really interesting, transformative. We know that guys' permission can be really important to how guys are. We know it's co-constructed, and we know things can change quite rapidly with good mentoring and changes to how people think. Okay, so to the presentation. So I want to lay that out as social constructions of masculinity is in the plural. Now, it's a little bit different to socialisation. Socialisation does assume to some extent that they know exactly what the idealised practices are, and therefore they measure the relationship to those idealised practices. 15 years later, I can guarantee you I don't know the idealised practices, but what I do know is that there's a plurality of dominant, hegemonic, masculine ideals and also configurations of practice. And I believe that they change across generations and time. And if I didn't believe that, I don't think I'd be doing the work. So just to say, with this one, the first one was to describe linkages between masculinities, food, body image, and their impact on men's health. So I thought a good place to start would be with fat men. Because as we often broach men's health, we set it up as competing victim discourse. We say there's more fat men than fat women, therefore we should focus on fat men. And so it's interesting, it's almost become the catchphrase for a whole bunch of biomedical comorbidities. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, there's a ton of others. Stroke, a bunch of things that sit underneath. And so if you can intervene around obesity, the promissory note is that you can make a difference to those things. And there's good reasons. Because remember the 4.7 years difference between men and women in terms of life expectancy? The number one reason for that difference is cardiovascular disease. So if we could intervene with obesity, wow, that'd be really good. And we could reduce male obesity. And of course the leap of logic would be that we'd reduce those morbidities and we'd extend men's lives. So let's digress just a little bit and think about how you'd help men think about obesity and think about what they eat and drink. And with an idea that you might be able to increase their activity and reduce what they eat and drink in terms of calorically dense kind of foods. So I think the example of zero is a great one. So they believe that zero worked for men as a soft drink option because the word diet wasn't in it. So it traded on the idea that you had enough masculine capital to buy this and you could drink pop, but it wouldn't add calories to you. They did the same with beer. And so if you reduce the carbs, you could still have the taste. And they're very clear about that. You know, don't forgo, you don't have to be prudish and let go of these things, but what you can do is be a responsible citizen. Again, stealing from Steve Robertson. I've read his book and I just keep stealing his words. And so, you know, the idea is that you set this up. And it's a familiar story. It's a really familiar story. Because the storyline is both flawed and familiar in many ways. So I was fortunate enough to have a really good postdoctoral student, Cameron White, and he wrote this paper, and we helped a little bit, but he did a great job on this. And the storyline is fantastic, and I'll read you a little bit of it. So the exact same example for low-calorie foods or for better-for-you foods was used in light cigarettes. And so, for example, Philip Morris, one of its first jobs was to purchase a beer company, Miller Brewing, in 1969. They followed by purchasing 7-Up in 1977. In 1985, the same company bought General Foods for $5.6 billion. Then they acquired Kraft for $13.6 billion. And then Philip Morris combined the two to make Kraft General Foods. Then they bought Nabisco Holdings from R.J. Reynolds, another tobacco producer, in 2000 for $14.9 billion. And Philip Morris became the biggest food company in the world. And so the idea that these better-for-you foods were good options helped guys to think about, well, I am responsible. I am doing something differently. And therefore, you know, I am doing the work of a responsible citizen. It's also interesting that, you know, there's a recent report released, and it looked at all of these better-for-you foods. And the title of the report was Better For You Foods, It's Just Good Business. And it showed that between 2006 and 2011, low-calorie sales increased by over $1.25 billion compared to $300 million for high-calorie products. It's a terrific story, you know, and you can argue it both ways. You can argue it as what a terrific story for men to open up the idea that they could reduce, you know, calorically dense choices and make better-for-you choices. And the inverse of that is the argument that it could be that really these companies aren't invested in men's health so much as invested in sales. And far be it from me to do a conspiracy theory, but if I apply the masculinities piece to this, if I actually think about where the hegemony lays, the hegemony for me, the hegemonic masculine structures, have had long-term residencies in the marketing and the education of men around food. and drink and cigarettes, and they've been able to do it for a very long time. And I'm reminded about how far we are behind as health practitioners in our application of how we think about gender in terms of how we might promote health. So I think tobacco has been an amazing example. Beyond the Marlboro Man and all of those iconic kind of pieces, they really have had a very strong influence. So in returning to my goal to describe the linkages between masculinity, food and body image and their impact on men's health, I'd just say, oftentimes we locate the problem in the individual, and that's okay to some extent, but never forget the structures with which they interact. And so you might get 20 minutes with them as a clinician in a consultation, but they're exposed to these ideas and these things the entire time. So in some ways there's some things to undo and there's some things to correct in terms of knowledge and in terms of trying to help people think differently. The example with cigarettes, the light cigarettes they were absolutely no better for you than the full strength ones, and oftentimes people would smoke more of them. And so with food, it might be less calories, it might be less carbs, but they might be doing a 12-pack instead of a 6-pack. So again, it doesn't really get into the idea that you might want to be thinking about consumption patterns. My second goal is to identify food and body types qualified as healthy for and by men. And here I've had to defer to experts in the field, and one of them is Don McCreary. And so Don's thesis suggests that men were actually absent from the body image work prior to 2000 because it was so focused on the thin ideal, and very few men were actually invested in the thin ideal. And so since 2000, he suggests that what's happened is the same currency has emerged for men in regards to the drive for muscularity. So that's his thesis. It's kind of a neat idea. And there is some empirical evidence around this. A couple of things. So some of their work suggests that women primarily, report a desire for a thin body type and low weight. And that's, again, those are ideals of femininity, about what's valued as beauty and aesthetics. And so the research has shown that when you ask a woman to describe her body shape and size, they often report themselves as heavier or larger than they actually are. And so for men, they tend to see themselves as smaller and lighter than they are. So for example, an overweight man would be likely to see himself as a normal weight, and a normal weight man see himself as underweight. So further to this work, Don McCreary ran a couple of studies, and they're interesting because they asked the guy to identify a silhouette that most closely matched his current body type, and then they asked him to choose one that was his masculine ideal. And so the difference was 29 pound more muscle was the ideal than what the guy actually saw himself currently as. And then they said, what about women? What would women like? And so, as the ideal masculine shape, muscularity, and they suggested that women actually would want something that was 31 pound more muscular. So again, you talk about the co-constructions of masculinity. It's like they're buying into the idea that women would actually like something muscular in a man, and so they're buying into it on a couple of levels. It's interesting, when they polled the women were way more close to the guy's actual body shape at the moment, so where they were at the moment, so rather than the ideals. But again, ideals are about perceptions too. So I think it's a fascinating kind of study, because then when you match it up and you start thinking about what that drive for muscularity means for men, they connect a whole bunch of comorbidities. So guys who are higher in the drive for muscularity report greater levels of depression and lower levels of self-esteem, higher levels of body dissatisfaction and self-consciousness. It also suggests that these guys have higher levels of neuroticism, perfectionism, narcissism, and desire for social dominance. And it's fascinating because you can never, ever achieve the ideal. If your perception's so out of whack that you can't see where you're at and where you want to be and kind of bridge that gap, it's a kind of a road to nowhere. So it's fascinating. The other person who does some great work in elite sports or in sports in general is Murray Drummond. He's from Flinders University in Australia. And one of Murray's most recent publications, it embraces this idea of elite footballers. So the Australian Football League, they've looked at. And so the percentages of guys that make the AFL is just like ridiculous. It's like 0.5% of the guys who actually play football and want to make it actually get in there. And the tenure for these blokes is a year, 2 years. That's usually as long as they last. Many of them will get drafted but never play. It's really a dumping ground. But the body type that now runs in the AFL is someone who could run a marathon. So it's muscular, but it's aerobically really able to keep running all day. So they run GPSs on these blokes, and they are doing serious kilometres over very, very quick times. So again, this setup about what this drive for muscularity and this drive for a certain embodiment of masculinity puts forward, it's the utopia of big money, of hegemony for a moment, and if you're lucky, a little bit longer than a moment in the AFL or in whatever competitive sports there are. So again, it's just these body types and these images, they do talk to other men. So the guy on the couch, he is thinking about performance, because many of these embodiments of masculinity in elite sports and in the drive for muscularity, they're aided by foods, by supplements. And so oftentimes guys will buy into this idea that certain foods will enhance their performance. And again, it's a good marketing fodder, for sure. And the trick is never talk about dieting. Always talk about what a man can eat, and therefore you focus on what they will be able to do rather than what they can't. Because we've got a long history of knowing that you can't really tell men what to do. You can empower them in a certain direction and help them believe they're making their own decisions, and ultimately they'll act. Again, I don't want to do conspiracy theory, but I do think that there's gateway drugs, there's gateway foods. So if you think about performance enhancing pieces, usually you'd start with diet change, and if you were really chasing a drive for muscularity, you'd reduce your fats, you'd sort of work in a certain direction, and then there's always that utopia of, something within the rules that you could embrace at a certain period in time that would aid your performance. And as long as you don't get caught, you're kind of going to be the hegemony. You're going to be the one who actually did really well, was world-renowned, had great success. And so I do think a lot of guys buy into this. And I think this quote is interesting for Lance Armstrong, because at that place and time, it was acceptable that he got the best out of his body by whatever means were available to him. It was almost like a science experiment, but it was quiet, but it was also widespread. And you could argue him as a fall guy or not, but the fact that he would do it again in that place and time, I think says a lot about masculine characteristics around competitiveness, around dominance. It sort of stands out. Of course, the trouble with the drive for muscularity and the drive for those things is if your perception of yourself is so out of kilter that you just won't ever attain it. The extreme is that you're risking a whole bunch of things, including your limbs in this particular example, to try and be a certain way. So my second goal was to identify food and bodies that qualify as healthy for men and by men. So in explicitly addressing this, I think it's fair to say that there's no doubt diversity in how men buy into muscularity and elite sports. But from Don McCreary's work, I think it's really clear that men's perceptions of themselves and their own muscularity can be quite discordant. And it's the perfect storm in some ways, because the attainment of muscularity can be impossible to secure. and let alone with these misconceptions that people have got. So while I don't have the answers, it does appear that men are increasingly sensitive and scrutinised around body image, and they're more susceptible to body dissatisfaction, and more likely to engage in appearance-related practices than perhaps previous generations of men. So I appreciate that I've, so far presented two extremes. I've expressed a concern about the fat men, the obese men, and then I've talked about, the guys that are elite athletes and the drive for muscularity. So it turns out we've got something that's emergent in the middle of those, and it's the dad bod. So this was just sort of emerged in April this year, and it's been trending for quite a while. Interesting, it's from a college writer, Mackenzie Pearson, and her summation is, there's just something about the dad bod that makes boys seem more human, natural and attractive. A dad bod isn't attractive because of what it looks like, but because of what it says. A dad bod says, I have a job, responsibilities, and enough money to nod approvingly when someone says guacamole is extra. It's a co-construction of masculinity. It's a wonderful, poignant example from a college-aged lady talking about what's attractive about the middle band. And that is, breadwinner, performativity, purchasing power. So again, at all levels, around embodiment, masculine is co-constructed. There's a kind of buy-in around it. It's interesting, they've also run a study because, of course, if you were going to espouse something like this as being attractive, then you'd want some empirical evidence, and they've done that. And so it actually shows a longitudinal study by Garfield that shows that BMI does in fact increase in new dads. So again, it's kind of the interesting space in which guys perform and operate. So my third and final piece is to thoughtfully consider the application of diverse masculinities and gender relations in the context of food and men's body image. And here I just revert to a couple of studies we've done to try and help us think about the plurality. So oftentimes we get called on the idea that with masculinities, you keep describing diversity and you never get into patterns. But I don't think we're done with this. I think we're on the hook for thinking a lot about the subgroups within men, because the numbers that I share with you in terms of gross numbers of Canadian men who identify as obese and are identified as obese versus, the subgroups within them, we start to do a bit of a disservice. We start to clump men all together. So we did some work with some South Asian immigrant men. So we have a lot of fellas who come from the Punjab area of India, and what tends to happen with those guys, they're farmers, and we interviewed these older men who were brought in on the family piece. You can sponsor, family sponsorship. So they'd often be living in the basement of their children's houses in Vancouver. And they would have you can't work for the first 3 months, and you have no health insurance for the first 3 months when you land in Vancouver. And we talked to these guys about what they eat and drink. And it was so interesting. They talked to us about their love of dairy and full cream milk as being a luxury item. And it was a luxury item in India, and it was very, very cheap, relatively, in Vancouver. So they were drinking a lot of milk, like a ton of milk. And then they talked about sugar, and they talked about how nearly every celebratory moment involved sweets, and plenty of sweets, good amounts of sugar. And again, that was kind of something that you could afford in Vancouver. And the other one they talked about was liquor. And so Sikh men officially don't drink liquor, but they share liquor. And the higher up on the shelf it is, the better it is, because it's prestigious. And to share with other men is particularly useful for these guys. It's a comfort when people visit. You draw them in. So there you've got this high kind of caloric intake or high dairy. You've got high sugar, and you've got high liquor in a community that really is overrepresented in terms of diabetes. So sort of thinking about how to message these guys. And we talked to them about how come they were doing these things. And they said, well, it doesn't matter. We do it because we believe in Sikhism, we believe in spirituality, and what will happen will happen. So it was fate. And it's so interesting because in Western men we'd say, well, that's fatalism, you know. It's kind of like you're not taking on something because you're saying, well, you're going to die anyway. But it wasn't actually the case. It was actually a test of their faith. So that helped us think about how you'd intervene. And we're also kind of interested in thinking about how to intervene in terms of the alcohol piece. So one of the temple leaders asked us to come in and talk about alcohol. And 2 minutes into the presentation, they shut us down because no one drinks. But yet we were asked to talk about alcohol. So again, in terms of intervening in particular practices, in trying to educate and in trying to create choices, it was really challenging with this group of men, because even though the behaviours kind of looked the same as Western men, what underpinned them was quite different. There was a bunch of traditional cultural, spiritual things that were quite different to Western guys that we talked to. So there was another thing that they do that helped us think about how we might intervene, and we tried a little bit of this at the temples. The temples have 24-hour kitchens, and the guys often serve the food to everybody who comes into the temple. And so we did a thing we coined spiritual marketing. So there's this idea that 10% of your life or savings should go towards helping the community, the collective. And so we appealed to the guys to think about how they might advance the health of other people who attend the temple, and how they might think about championing change for other people and reducing the portion size that they're delivering to people and things like that. So it's kind of interesting. I think it's just a great example of trying to think about behaviours beyond the behaviour. So getting to what underpins it to then go, okay, what's an acceptable intervention in terms of it? The other one that I'll share with you is just an interesting one to me, because again, it's a PhD student, really talented PhD student, did some work around gender relations and food in the context of men experiencing prostate cancer. A lot of blokes don't die of prostate cancer. It's often experienced as a chronic illness. So the survival rates are huge for 5 and 10 years. So it's something people live with. And so diet becomes a bit of a crux in this. And so, traditionally in heterosexual couples, you would believe that the woman would typically prepare the food, give the food. And that was actually true of the couples in this study. But what was also true is that the women defaulted to the men's preferences for particular foods. So again, if you were going to intervene, you might be a bit tempted to intervene with the female partners because they're preparing the food. But in fact, it was the men you needed to talk to about preferences and potential changes. So some foods are positioned as kind of remedy for prostate cancer. Other foods are positioned as kind of antidotes to some of the side effects that men get. Urinary incontinence being one of those side effects for treatments. So again, thinking about those fluids that are a bit diuretic, that you might want to avoid and things like that. So the education around those. So I think, just in terms of this third and final piece, in some ways we need to find remedies that are as robust as the better for you food marketing. We need to find some ways of messaging guys around those particular issues. Final points. So just to say, I think men's relationships to food are really complex. So again, I'd reiterate that when we talk about masculinities, we're actually talking about social determinants of health, masculinity being one of them, but it intersects with culture, class, place, money, all of those things. And so to try and think about it in an intersectional way, for want of a better term, I think is really, really important. The relationship between men and body image is also, incredibly important. I kind of like this caption, your child will follow your example, not your advice, but I actually don't believe it covers and really attends to the fact that over generations we're seeing changes in how people operate and how guys are. The lumbersexual wasn't here, 30 years ago. Not in name and not in some of the practices that are happening. So again, the permission of other men and the guidance of other men, I think, is really key, as is women in these men's lives. So I guess my closing point would be just to say a reminder, and it's on all of us to do health promotion, men's health promotion, where we are. Never underestimate your influence on how guys embody masculinity, practice masculinity, and in the context of health and in the context of seeking help, or in the context of even contemplating seeking help, you can be a masterstroke, linchpin champion in bringing them into a space where they can get a dialogue and actually move forward. Thank you.
Question.
Yeah.
Oui.
Hi, John.
Hey, Philip.
Is Jamie Oliver's having an impact on men's diet, the way they eat? Or Ricardo here? I think with the media attention around star chef, mainly men, is there evidence that it has an impact on the way men eat or the way men consider food?
Yeah, so I don't know of the empirical evidence, Philippe, but you would like to imagine that a guy as a chef or as a cook would open opportunities for guys to think about being involved in food preparation in ways that traditionally they may not have thought about. You'd like to think that. And I guess that the risk, though, is that, you see these guys on TV and it's quite the hegemony, right? The celebrity chef, and it's quite the entrepreneurial kind of moment. And so you'd love to have some assurances that it would actually happen in the domestic sphere and not be entirely about, celebrity, if you know what I mean.
And
Yeah.
If I may, the question is, who are we reaching? When we talk about the non-sexual, eat organic food, the microcalories and cocktails, but mainly educated,
Yep.
middle privileged
class we're talking about.
Yep.
How to reach people into other social classes?
Yeah, I agree with you. And, I think that it's an interesting example of a particular identity that's been taken on, and you can argue it as masculine capital because they've got the ability to do the consumerism. And I agree, the hard-to-reach populations are the ones probably without that purchasing power that you're trying to create opportunities for. But I agree, even the better-for-you foods, they can be a little bit more expensive than the calorically dense choices that people make and are forced to make as well. So choice isn't even the right word there. So I don't have the answer to that one for you, Philippe, but I agree with you. It's, the middle class kind of white dominance, I agree. It's one of those tough ones that you want to think about different identities and how to message those. Maybe the counterpoint is with, older South Asian brown men who, don't have that, don't necessarily even have English as a first language necessarily in BC. So, yeah.
D'autres questions? Dans les sites de visio, pas de questions? Dr. Oliffe, when you talked about the dad bod,
Yeah.
do you consider it's the healthier type of masculinity?
I think it's I think it makes a lot of us feel better. I don't know, I can't speak for other men, but anyway, no, I don't know if it's a new masculine idea. I like that there's a kind of a little bit of reason in it. It's not saying prudish, deny yourself all the things that you like and enjoy. It's saying moderation to me, and it's saying, there's a space between, this obesity that can just predispose you to comorbidities, and there's a space between, the elite athlete piece, and most of us do actually sit in that space. And I think that space can be okay with regular exercise and you know, and doing the right things. Yeah. Yep.
So this is a question about thinking about kind of marketing to different communities' messages about health, welfare, body type diet. And how much do you think it's kind of effective and constructive over the long term to kind of use masculinities and masculine norms and some of the kind of practices in society and beliefs with trying to deconstruct those or challenge them for people a little bit too? So it's like using the norms versus kind of challenging the norms.
So the way we position the norm, so two things. One, hegemonic masculinity is about power at one level, and it's also about characteristics at another level. And so characteristics such as self-reliance, autonomy, risk-taking, those kind of things, you can position those things as bad for health, or you can try to talk to those characteristics as being a strength-based approach to health promotion. So I would argue that self-reliance and autonomy are exactly what we trade on when that man walks out of the consultation and you want sustainable change in his diet because you've just told him that, you know, you need to think about this. If he's not autonomous and he's not self-reliant, and even if he's not, you know, a little bit of competitiveness can be good too with other guys, you know, to go forth with change, then I think, you know, it's a disservice to always pathologise masculinity characteristics as that's bad for you. You know, men don't go to the doctor because they're self-reliant. Okay, maybe, but maybe men go to the doctor because they are self-reliant and independent and seek consultation. And I think that the trick here is to garner self-management, because it's ultimately what we want to do anyway. 99% of health promotion takes place in the guy's head at home. There's very few consultation moments. Yeah.
C'est tout? Dernière chance? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Oliffe.